Hi, this is Clay Boykin, and I am in search of the new compassionate male. I've just completed an interview with Don Frick. Don is the official biographer for the late Robert Greenleaf. Robert Greenleaf coined the term servant leadership. Servant leadership goes far beyond leadership style or leadership techniques. Servant leadership embodies the principles that I consider foundational for all people who presently lead others or aspire to lead others. The principles of servant leadership confront patriarchy head-on and go far beyond merely sitting at the top of an organization. Whether or not you are in the leadership position, servant leadership is worth every person's consideration. Here's that conversation.
Hello world, it's me, Dennis, and today on In Search of the New Compassionate Male, I'm here with the founder, Clay Boykin, and our special guest. Clay, take it away.
Thanks, Dennis. Don Frick is here. I have been wanting Don to join us ever since June 16th of 2016. That was when you and I met.
Hello, especially you two.
I remember the first times that Clay and I talked about doing this, you came up because there has not been a conversation that we have had that has not had the underpinnings of servant leadership, of you by name as we have, and to have you on is a dream come true for me, and I know it is for Clay. So Clay, go ahead and lead us into a conversation with Don.
Servant leadership is just, it's part of my fabric. And I'll tell you just a quick story. Don's brother, Jack, is one of our fellows in our men's circle.
I love Jack.
And we had Jack on a while back, right? One night we were talking about servant leadership in our circle. And afterwards, Jack came up to me and says, Clay, my brother, Don, is an official biographer for Robert Greenleaf, who coined the term servant leadership back in 1970 or so. And I looked at him and I literally grabbed him by the lapels and I says, I've got to talk with Don. He said, I'll set it up. And you and I met in June of 2016. That day was magic. As a matter of fact, I pulled out my journal. Do you remember this?
I remember it vividly. And I remember thinking, how the hell does he do all that?
Well,
that's what I thought. Thank you, Don. Thank you. It's not just me, because the outpicturing of Clay, of your ability to take the thoughts and put them into a picture form with words is absolutely stunning. I've never known anyone that can do it like you can do.
Well, this was my study of 7 pillars of servant leadership, Don's book, before Don and I met. And that's the way I learned. And Don, I'd like if you could tell us some about how you got started, where servant leadership came up in your life, because I think you've spent the better part of your life in this field.
Well, I had an amazing mentor named Ann McGee Cooper from Dallas. She was on the Greenleaf Center's board and knew Robert Greenleaf. So one day in 1986, I was 40 years old. I got a little manila envelope that had this essay called The Servant as Leader. So I sat there and couldn't quit reading. I read it in one sitting. I turned the last page and thought, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my career to understanding and sharing this stuff. It pulls together so many threads in my life, and I didn't totally understand it. It took me years to do that, and I still don't do it. I still learn new things from it. It wasn't so much a decision as an answer. 2 years later, I'd had a broken leg on New Year's Day, and a few weeks after that, there was the first national conference on servant leadership, and Robert Greenleaf was attending by speakerphone. Most of these were people who knew him and worked with him. So I drug my rear down to Atlanta and met all these people. And then there was a board meeting that one of those days of the conference, and they decided they were going to move their headquarters to Indianapolis, where I lived. Not only did they do that, but they moved to the same building where I had my office next door. And I just thought, God will punish me forever if I don't. So I did, and they'd hired a director, and I went over and talked to him, and he said, boy, we just right now got a grant from the Lilly Endowment to go through the archives of Robert Greenleaf, find things that are unpublished that should be published. So luckily they hired somebody else, my colleague Ann Fraker, who really was an archivist. I wouldn't have known what I was doing. But so we spent 4 years, half-time, translating some of Bob's handwriting, reading things we discovered in an entire book that even his family didn't know he had written. And out of that, I was involved in publishing some things and so forth. After all this time doing this, and I met astonishing people involved with that organization. I remember one time I got to sit on the board meetings just to listen. And the head of the board said, well, here's this issue and we need to talk about it and see where we come. Well, they all believe in consensus decision-making. And that means consensus in a Quaker way, we can go into later if you want to. But Jim said, what's the sense of the group? Well, they didn't have a total sense. There was one new person who said, well, I think we've talked enough to vote. And there's a silence in the room. And Jim Tatum was his name, the chair of the board. And he said, well, we don't vote. The guy said, well, how do you make decisions? He said, we keep talking. And if we have a sense of the group and you don't agree with it, you can, not vote for it. So anyway, they ended up breaking off into another group. And I went, whoa, what is this? So I had read enough of Greenleaf by then that I kind of knew what he meant by it. Decided I wanted to do Greenleaf's biography because there was none. And the materials had not been available until now when we went through the archives. And I talked to Newcomb Greenleaf, his son, and I said, Newcomb, I'd like to do your father's biography. He said, why? I said, well, there are really 3 reasons. Number 1, I'd like to know if he lived this stuff. Number 2, where did he get his ideas? And number 3, I think he did a better job of dealing with his demons, his inner demons, than my father did, or than I have done. I'd like to know how he did it. He goes, oh, okay. Well, is the LSD going to be in? LSD is something, I got a whole chapter about it. It was legal.
Well, absolutely, it was a big movement.
Doctors. Oh, yeah. And Cary Grant was running around saying, everybody's got to try this. You'll know how crazy people feel. And psychiatrists were recommending it. So Bob took LSD. He loved it because he was a natural meditator. It just, the doors of perception were open. But there were a number of people in the servant leadership movement. Well, anyway, let me finish that. Newcomb then said, let me talk to my sisters, but that sounds good to me. So they just opened up. I went out to their houses. I saw all the family albums. It's a wonderful, interesting family. Now, as I started the biography, there were a number of people who had known Bob for a long time, and I think had kind of turned him into a kindly Quaker icon. Now, the better they knew him, the more they knew that wasn't true. But a lot of people had started to do that even by 1994 when I had this idea. And they didn't like the LSD stuff. And I said, look, I'm not doing an investigative report. I'm trying to understand a life. So I went ahead and did it. I had to raise the money to live. While I did that, I read the book of Job twice during the process. But it's kind of like old Jonah being swallowed by the whale. And finally, God had been telling me, you gotta go to Nineveh. Nah. The whale swallows him, spits him out right there near Nineveh. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And that was the hold that grabbed me. Again, it was persistent, absolutely real. You need to do this. And I hadn't even thought through why I needed to do it. Part of it was that there are a lot of people alive then that I could talk to who knew and worked with Bob, and they were gone before too long. So it was so much work. I started thinking, there's a lot I don't know about American business, because he was a businessman. And this is a lot of work. Maybe I should find a way to get credit, some kind of academic credit for it. So I chose a place called the Union Institute in Cincinnati, it was founded by 13 college presidents who thought the way higher education, and especially doctoral degrees, were delivered absolutely sucked. So if you're a middle life person, and a lot of people, they want the degree. Said, look, you probably know what you want to study, and so we're not going to you have to do this. Not only that, you have a choice of people from all over the country who can be on your committee of their PhDs. So I was able to get my mentor, Ann McGee Cooper, people I'd read about, and there still was a head of the committee, and he was a specialist in assessment, which is something that Greenleaf was famous for. So I did that. And while I was there, it's like, oh, that looks like an interesting class I can take too. I probably did twice as many hours as I needed. And because the rest of the academic community didn't like this learning model, through the history of Union Institute, they fired them and they said, they got to take away their accreditation. And so we had to do everything really well. I mean, it took me 7 years, that's the maximum amount of time, to finally get it. But my dissertation, after I had helped design my own courses on the history of business decision-making, just a number of things I simply didn't know. And finally got my degree. My dissertation was sort of a first draft of the biography. So it really worked out.
And what year was this?
I started in school in 2000. I got the degree. The book was published because I had done the dissertation pretty early, actually. And the book was published in 2004, the biography. And then I just kind of went on, and through the whole thing, I lost a wife, a pretty good wife. It's kind of like, well, that's your dream, but it's not mine.
Mm-hmm.
But what are we going to do? And I thought, I want to be on my deathbed saying, I really had an interest. There was a passion there, and there was a absolute compelling force for me to do this project. I wish I'd have done that.
No.
Not going to do that.
Don, one of the things I'm interested in is how relevant servant leadership is today. It's like it becomes more relevant rather than it being something of the past. Could you talk about today and how in this non-hierarchical, nodal, influence rather than authority, the work, the gig economy, just in time, so much of the work, and how all that applies so much today?
It does. On the other hand, I just read an article by a guy who said servant leadership is passé. It's got a bad name. You shouldn't use the word servant. And what people want, they do want somebody who cares about them. So let's call it selfless leadership or something like that. That's servant leadership light, I call it, because servant leadership requires skills and capacities, first of listening. You go into any of these in a deep way, but persuasion, which is not me telling you and arguing with you, persuasion means that you arrive at a feeling of rightness. You take the step, and that the one doing the persuading is also open to being persuaded.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That's just one example. So many of these ethical use of power is persuasion. Foresight it's not forecasting, it's foresight. And again, Greenleaf uses intuition. At Dartmouth, he once taught a class on intuition and business decision making. It was sold out every time he. And but it can't be measured very well now, can it? So a lot of that didn't fit in too well.
Yes, but it can't be measured. Don, it may not be able to be measured, but as Clay and I were talking the other day, radio waves, we didn't invent radio waves. Radio waves were there before we had the instruments to measure them. Just because we don't have the particular instruments or the level of consciousness to perceive it does not mean it's not real.
Absolutely. Look, and I'm right now working on an outline for a class that would be called The Dark Side of Leadership. And I have to go, you know these things. You got to do goals and objectives for any training class. At the end of this class, you will be able to describe, explain, compare and contrast, all this B.F. Skinner stuff. I have yet to see, in addition, an outcome like the learner, not just a student, because it's a learner, should be a co-learner, by the way, with a teacher. Anyway, I've never seen statements like, at the end of this class, you will have experienced awe. Mm-hmm. You'll find a renewed interest in a love of learning. You know, you will have, at the end of this class, you will have at least dabbled in some art form, writing, sculpture, movement, whatever it is. At the end of this class, you will have grown as a person and be able to tell us why. I've not seen that because it's often easier to do something more easily measured. And for gosh sakes, what would that person do on campus that is responsible for keeping track of all these outcomes and stuff for classes so they can give them over to the assessment team that comes in once every 10 years? I've murdered more sheets of paper providing stuff like that. The most successful class I ever taught was a graduate seminar in servant leadership. I decided, look, these people that already knew a little bit about it, but I thought, I'm not going to tell them what to learn all the time. Greenleaf was very involved in the early founding of tea groups and stuff like that. So we just sat there and exchanged ideas. We exchanged ourselves. And at the end of the class, I said, well, we need to do a ritual that celebrates all this. I'm not going to plan it. I didn't plan that much in that class. And so they did. And they did something in the arts. And they did without me even telling them to do this. They did something that was just mind-blowing. One guy showed up with a poem that's so good that I put it in that 7 Pillars of Certain Leadership book, when you see it. It's about presence. It's just about being present. So it works if the teacher gets their head out of the way and reads Parker Palmer about teaching, the art of teaching, and has awareness and presence.
Don, it's been my experience that so much of the leadership comes from the heart. And when they were trying to get you to fill out the paperwork and the goals and objectives and everything, that was all the head stuff. And you were trying to bring in the heart aspect so you had a balance. And we just had
it's necessary to do but not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient for scholar, learners, seekers. Let's put seeker in there too.
Yeah. So true.
I agree. And Don, what I love about what you're doing is that just like, what was it about you? I'm curious that you were strong enough to be able to adopt a woman as a mentor, to be able to be so, because I saw Ernest Holmes. Ernest Holmes adopted Emma Curtis Hopkins as a mentor. So many of the leading lights that I have seen have been able to bridge the continuum in order to be able to be led and in order to be able to be part of this process.
Well, there were some things that were quite congenial to me. I always, living in Last Chance, Colorado for the first 9 years of my life, where there's nothing but rattlesnakes and stuff. I was the only kid in my one-room school class in my age. So I would go out and play in the fields, and I just kind of marveled at, I'd be in the high plains, and I'd find seashells, fossilized seashells. What are they doing here? So that led me to start thinking about, there are realities beneath what I see. And there's a history between what I know, there's a link between history and what I see. So I used to think, well, what's underneath what I'm seeing? One time, we'd had a real drought, and it rained, finally, and the cactuses went, yoing, and it rained tadpoles. They had been picked up over by Denver somewhere, probably, and and we had little tadpoles and little frogs jumping around. Now, so what's beneath what I see? That was always that led me to go to seminary and try to figure stuff out that using that language. It led me to try a lot of things that came along. That was just part of who I was. I was sort of a little cosmologist from my earlier days, kind of like the Native American tribe that had a creation story that the world, the reality that we see, sits on the shell of a turtle. So this person, have you heard this? This person was interviewed by an anthropologist and said, well, what's under the turtle? Said another turtle. What's under that? There's another turtle. In fact, it's turtles all the way down. And so I didn't think it was quite that simple, but there was something all the way down. I'll tell you what, I once did a film on Native American art for the Indianapolis Museum of Art in the museum. They called it then the American Indian Museum. I'm sure it's different now. And I was out in Taos in New Mexico. I was speaking with a potter, and her name was Blue Corn. So this is back in the film days. So she's working on this and that. I discovered that her little pots sold for about $900 at the United Nations gift shop. And she didn't tell me that, by the way, other people did. But I did ask her about some of her pots there, and I said, well, I knew better than to ask, what does that mean? So I just said, well, talk to me about this design. She said, well, that's the dragon that lives under the ground. And when he gets mad, he shakes his tail and it causes earthquakes. And I must have had unconsciously some kind of a look that's a nice little Indian story. I must have, I don't know. I certainly wasn't aware of it because I grew up around a lot of Navajos and went to those reservations with my father. Anyway, she took one look at me and said, well, it's true. My father told me it was true, and his father told him it was true, so it's true. And I thought, well, if nothing else, it's certainly true metaphorically. It's about what we do to the earth and so forth and so on. But honestly, I've never been down there. As far as I know, there's a dragon down there. and it was all done, there's a very thin scrim between the spiritual world and everyday life with Native Americans I've met and spent time with. Very thin. And it really is all spirit infused. I call my film a window to the spirit, because that's what sand painting and these objects I saw, that's what the dances really are about, being inspirited, you and the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to take a little bit of a tangent here.
Okay. I haven't answered several of your questions yet.
Well, so we're in search of the new compassionate male. And
yes,
it's my belief that the new compassionate male is emerging, and he's emerging as a new archetype. And it's come to me over the past couple of years that that's how to describe it. And everywhere that I've gone across the United States, gone into Africa, everyone says yes, that this patriarchy has pushed down this male energy, and now it's coming up in the form of, we know what's really right. We know what's right in our heart, but we've had to push down and conform. And it's at a point now where it's rising up. Now, it's not in the news, you don't see it, but there's that burn within every man, that emptiness of what we think is emptiness, but is really the essence of love, exercised from my vantage point as compassion. And so the intersection of servant leadership and compassion is an idea that I'd really like to delve into a little bit. And I'm just curious about your observations in that.
Greenleaf is kind of infused in me. But it turns out that he, in his seeking, I, without knowing it, paralleled some of the same kinds of experiences. Greenleaf was born in 1904. We can say he was a 19th century male in his attitudes. He died in 1990, having already foreshadowed 21st century males. And at one point, I decided I would do some dream therapy. I was a little screwed up at the time, but not awfully. I just thought, that's interesting. Do some dream therapy. The guy who was my therapist was finishing his PhD in Jungian psychology at the University of Chicago, and he knew all the lights up there. So in the process of doing that, I realized, well, I had to look at my father wound. And I did a number of other things with men's groups too. I had to look at that, and I realized that my shadows were not to be denied, and that I didn't solve them. I had to eat them. I had to eat my shadows so that I could get the gold and the richness out of it, because that's where the gold lies once you dive right into it, walk through it. I hated it. I hated to do it. I didn't have a choice. But when it came to talking about anima and animus, I just really realized, as Greenleaf did when he did 2 years of Jungian dream therapy with Martha Jaeger and Dr. Ira Progoff. Ira Progoff, well, I won't go into all those, but they were just, Martha Jaeger knew Jung quite well. So he had a problem with his anima, the female energy. His wife, or excuse me, his mother was a drunk, a mean drunk. And so he had a good heart. I mean, he really was genuinely kind, but he still has a lot of attitudes that were patriarchal. And yet he had this wife. He said, she was an artist. She studied in Paris in the 1920s, studied Cubism in Paris. She was an architect, smarter than him. She told him what to read a lot of the time. But early on in their marriage, he'd look at her abstract art and he'd say, I don't like that. Why don't you paint something, traditional? She said, okay, Robbie. And then she did for a while, and then she started painting more and more abstract things. Meanwhile, he got proud of his wife's art, and he took 2 pieces into his office at AT&T. One of them was a very realistic one, and another one was an abstract piece. People would walk in and say, I understand that one, but what's that one? You see, it's like music. This one has lyrics that you can understand, and this one over here is pure music. It's pure joy. Well, within a year or two, she had him doing abstract Japanese designs on pottery in the basement. So he evolved through this, and that stuff that was sort of cracking him open to being a person who is naturally compassionate. And yet here he was in the world's largest organization working at very high levels of it.
May I interrupt for a second, Don? Am I taking you at a place, am I getting to a place where I can interrupt, or did I stop you before you were making a point that was important in that? Well, because you were talking about cracking open, and I love that as an evolution, because it feels to me at 72 that all of my experiences is that it is in the DNA for us to be compassionate. It's in the DNA for us to be loving. Right. It's built in there. We then put shells and other artifices over it that prevent that from coming out. But then when it cracks open, that is released.
Yes. And I always, grew up in a hunting culture out early on the ranches in Colorado, knew how to kill a rattlesnake with my own 22 when I was 6 years old.
Mm.
But I always felt sorry for the rabbits. And as soon as I could do it and be still considered a man, I quit hunting. Or if I did, I would say, oh, there's a goose, and I'd miss him. I just had a reputation of being a terrible shot because that was in there and I needed to let it out. Now with Greenleaf, as he evolved and hired the first Black person and the first females at AT&T, the first ones who were non-menial roles. And he didn't wave a flag about it. In meetings, he never wanted to be the chairman. He wanted to be the record keeper and be there. And so he still be present. And so he saw, because he was just hyper aware, he saw conflicts happening and so forth. He never judged that. He would find common ground and he would sometimes haul out his warrior when it was necessary. He would usually, though, show compassion. For a lot of these people who started out as, like he did, putting telephone poles in muddy ground, Mm-hmm. So he demonstrated that. He really did understand some of the dynamics of the damage patriarchy had done to him. And Dennis and Clay, I don't think he had the mythological language for it to really nail it down. He did it as he went on, but he was interested in organizations, and he defined organizations as how you get things done. So he wanted to model things. He said, I'm not an academic. I'm a math major, And he was. But he was a brilliant, world-class researcher. Got AT&T to buy the second mainframe IBM ever made. The Defense Department got the first one, just so he could research the development of persons. His title at AT&T was Director of Management Development. Now, I read one article said he was a terrible Greenleaf and all this sort of leadership stuff. He was just a patriarch and sort of disguise and blah, 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 blah. And so what can you do? You just say, I remember one time I was up to, I won't go into that. Let's stay on the topic. So Greenleaf understood that problem. He said, why do we call everybody a chairman? Why not a chairperson? This is in 1959.
Wow.
Yep.
Amazing. Don, we will not get, it's very hard to especially in this time, be able to get an absolute consensus, because you're going to be able to hear things along a spectrum, which is rather than to be in this binary state of he was wonderful, he was terrible. It's somewhere along this continuum as to what can I learn from and with this person.
Mm-hmm. And it's such a temptation to jump in and be ironic and cynical and so forth.
That's the low bar.
Lawrence Vanderpost. Yeah, it is. Lawrence Vanderpost is a great South African filmmaker. He wrote about, the first one to write about the Kalahari Bushmen. He was he was a filmmaker, anti-activist, or an activist for anti-apartheid causes. And he was once talking with an American audience, and somebody raised their hand and said, "Oh my goodness, what can we do? What can we do to help out this terrible thing?" Meanwhile, we had apartheid in the southern states. He said, "I think you should declare a year of silence." Now that's Greenleaf's. It's kind of how he is. So he's pretty mystical in his own way. He introduced the Buddhist priest who wrote the first book about Buddhism that was just a bestseller in America. I got to be friends with him, just like he did Eleanor Roosevelt and a lot of folks. So he was a seeker who didn't judge, but you may call it judging, but it wouldn't be that. It would be persuasion in his sense, which is hard.
Oh, God,
one guy
yes.
who's a man at AT&T who was kind of mentored by Bob Greenleaf, was assigned to be over AT&T, one of the Bell companies that was in charge of all of Manhattan. Well, this was back, I don't know, the 70s or something. I barely remember it. The service was so bad at Wall Street that they couldn't even get a dial tone. So everybody was up in arms. So this guy went in and he just sat for 6 months and he listened because he trusted that people knew what they could do, but nobody had ever listened to them. Just like Clay has externalized in ways we can understand that we have compassion in us all. We don't have to run around and go, "I'm compassionate, damn it." So this man went and listened. And he brought in all the officials and said, "Well, tell me what's going on." And he listened. And it wasn't fake listening, and it wasn't active listening with all these tips and tricks like you go, "Yes, tell me more." It wasn't that. You might sit there for 3 minutes with everybody silent.
Mm-hmm.
They figured it out in 6 months. I mean, they started to figure it out well before that, but it was fully fixed within 6 months.
Mm.
It's a non-rational in one sense by consensus reality standards. These are sort of non-rational ways, but they're not irrational.
No.
The ways of helping other people grow.
Howard Teich was on our program a month or two ago, and he brought up an idea that that I had never heard before, and it was talking about the solar energy and the lunar energy as another different way of saying male energy or feminine energy, because we get all tied up in those conversations. And his point was that the sun shines, and that's our kind of our head. That's what people would say the male energy. And then the lunar, the moon, reflects, and that may be the divine feminine energy. And he said that the lunar leads and the solar executes. And I thought about that for a minute. At first I thought, if lunar is kind of equates to the feminine energy and you're saying that leads, I'm not buying it. And then I went back and thought, well, wait a second. What was my experience with leadership in the Marine Corps? It was all about heart. All about heart. Marines take care of one another. And yes, we have the strategies and the tactics and all the head stuff. That's where we execute. But without heart, you have no core. And I just wanted to bring that out, that it seems like this whole effort, whether it's, Carl Jung or Greenleaf or Tom Peters or, Kouzes and Posner, all these people are talking about leadership from different vantage points. And they're all trying to get to the same place. Awaken the heart and integrate it with the head.
And the problem for many people, as a friend of mine says, Phil said that we have to move servant leadership from here, down here. I mean, if you've done a lot of school or read a lot of books, let me put that another way. I did a lot of school. I've read a lot of books and find myself with that challenge. Every workshop I do, every class I teach, I find myself with that challenge to not forget the experience, but to move it down. Now, Greenleaf believed that wisdom is not poured into one's head. He said, if you have a mentor at a new job, somebody comes up and says, hey, listen, I've been around a while. Let me tell you how this works here. I'll tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. Just follow my wisdom. Greenleaf said, if you do that, if you're foolish enough to do that, you're taking on that other person's limitations. And so what one must do is have experiences. That helps, but that's not wisdom. Learn whatever you can. That's good, but that's not wisdom. He said you have to reflect on it. You have to do what he calls practice the art of withdrawal. And that's how it becomes yours and your wisdom. And don't believe that you should be going out and trying to tell other people they need to accept your wisdom either. They can learn from it, but they got to reflect on it too.
I'm so glad you said that. And this whole idea of the old guy at the company taking the younger guy and say, let me show you the ropes. And that being really a limiting factor. It reminded me of something I happened into in my days at Motorola. We had some turnover going on, and we'd bring in a new engineer every once in a while. And I would sit him down and say, now listen, once a week, I want you to come in here and tell me what you see and ask me questions. Ask me why. And we're going to do this for 3 months. And so they would start doing this. And towards the end, and I would learn things. And it wasn't like I was spying on anything, but it was fresh eyes looking at the innocent why is sometimes the hardest question to answer. And towards the end of the 3 months, he said, well, can we continue? And I said, no, because your eyes aren't fresh anymore. You're assimilated into the organization. But taking that the fresh ideas, because sometimes I know that something would be just staring me in the face. And I thought I was creative and I had leadership and it brought it all in. And somebody would say, well, Clay, why are you doing that? And I would find that oftentimes I couldn't answer that question.
You had good motives, damn it.
And I had good motives.
Okay? No. I know. Don, we're coming to the end of this first hour. And one of the problems I have with you is that I have started off on 1,000 different journeys that I want to follow up on. Because your consciousness, the level of your exploration and the courage that you have displayed in your life, the curiosity, the willingness to grow is inspiring me more than you will ever know. And I will work to take that with me. And all I will ask from you is that you come back again with us, that you continue, that we walk a few more trails together. that you get a chance to be there because your light is so bright.
Thank you. Greenleaf started writing the essay, The Servant is Leader, when he was 64 years old. I started my biography of him when I was 55 years old. I went and decided to do a PhD. I was 56 years old, and started his biography later. My point is that I didn't care what other people told me about it. Was ridiculous to do a PhD. I wasn't going to be around long enough to use it. Well, they didn't get it. But as long as that crazy, non-rational passion is driving you, Clay, you, Dennis, and clearly it is with both of you. I just think we can't go wrong if we don't, as long as we don't start believing our own stuff as the answer.
Yeah.
Can't go wrong.
Yeah.
No, and that's
Spirit
Boy,
is what answers
I think we
serve.
I think we put a pin in it right there with from my vantage point, like echoing Dennis, an open invitation to come back, because like Dennis, I've got so many different trails to go on. So what do you think, Dennis?
yes. Please, Don, you you are coming back if I have anything to say about it. So I'm putting my marker in the sand, not in the sand. I'm putting it in the stone, so that we will have you back and continue this. Thank you, Don, for this wonderful time with us in this very all too fast time. And I look forward to continuing our next conversation with you. And Clay, dear Clay, thank you so much. And thank you everyone who is listening or watching another episode, this one with Don Frick, in search of the new compassionate male. Everyone, we will see you next time.